Good morning, guys. We are continuing what I started in the Zoom on Tuesday, day 4, solving rational equations, finding least common denominator, possibly 2 solutions. I did the more difficult one with you guys on Zoom Tuesday. The equations that you guys are going to solve today, a little bit easier, not so much factoring in terms of the answer that you're going to find. So for the first example that I did, we found the least common denominator, so the left fraction had x minus 1. Again, these are going to be in your notes as well, so if you want to copy them down, you can. So x minus 1 is your left denominator. 1 is the middle denominator, x squared minus 1. That is a quadratic that needs to be factored, so I factored down into x minus 1, x plus 1. So when you're finding the least common denominator, its left fraction has x minus 1. Middle fraction has a 1. I don't need to write the 1 down. And then the right fraction has x minus 1 and x plus 1. So because it already had the x minus 1, I don't need to write it again because it's what they had in common. What I need to write down is the x plus 1 coming from my right side of the equation where that right fraction was. So step 1 is finding the least common denominator. Did that. Once you find the least common denominator, the next step is to multiply each fraction by what is missing from the least common denominator. So my left fraction is missing x plus 1, so I have to multiply top and bottom by x plus 1. The middle fraction is missing both parts, x minus 1 and x plus 1, so I have to multiply my middle fraction by both of those. The right side had all of my least common denominator, so I don't have to multiply that by anything. So then coming down here, my next step is to use the distributive property and FOIL. So my numerators are going to cancel out. Once I find the least common denominator for the left fraction, the middle fraction, the right fraction, they just cancel each other out. So all I'm truly solving is the numerator for each of these. So when I come down here, this work that I'm doing is just based on the numerator. So 5x times x plus 1, distributive property. X minus 1 times x plus 1, that's FOIL. When I'm done foiling, I get x squared minus 1. And then I'm going to also have to distribute this minus 2. And the minus 2 is coming from, again, the middle part of my equation. And then on the right side of the equation, I have a 14, and I don't have to multiply that by anything. So let me reemphasize to you guys that you have to multiply by the missing parts. So you have to be using distributive property or FOIL when you're doing that step. Once I have these multiplied, then I'm just going to add like terms. So I'm adding my 5x squared and my negative 2x squared to get 3x squared. I'm not adding anything to my 5x because there's no other like term with my 5x. And then I'm going to add nothing to my 2 because my 2 is the only thing that is in the actual real number. It is a quadratic, and it's a quadratic because of the 3x squared. So the 3x squared means that my quadratic equation will have to be set equal to 0. So here I subtracted 14 so that I'm getting my quadratic equal to 0. So now I have 3x squared plus 5x minus 12 because I subtracted 14 from the 2. Unfortunately, this is the factoring method that we have to use the box. So the box method means that you're multiplying the first term times the last term, which is negative 36x squared, listing the factors of negative 36 that add to be the middle. And again, this is the box method from the factoring method. You could also use the quadratic formula if you remembered that. So once I find my 2 that multiply to be negative 36, I'm going to find what adds to be 5. I put those 2 in my opposite boxes. To get from the inside of the box out, we're taking the greatest common factor horizontally on the top, horizontally on the bottom, vertically left, and vertically right. So these are the factors that come from this quadratic by me using the box method. Once I have my factors, I'm going to set them equal to 0 and solve. And I'm getting 2 answers on this particular question. The other thing that you have to check is you have to check your excluded values, and the excluded values come from simply the denominator setting those equal to 0 to see what values they do not exist at. So I set x plus 1 equal to 0, I set x minus 1 equal to 0, and I get x cannot be plus or minus 1. So I go back down to my answer, and I check my answer, and neither one of those are x plus 1 or x minus 1, so I'm okay. So that was definitely a more difficult type question. The questions we're going to do today do include some factoring, but not necessarily as much with the distributive property, FOIL, and factoring. So today we're doing these same steps. I posted this in the Zoom on Tuesday, finding the least common denominator. We're going to multiply each fraction by what is missing each term, which eliminates the denominators. We're going to use FOIL and distributive property to the numerator only. We're going to add like terms to the numerator only. If it's a quadratic, then you set it equal to 0. And if it's not, it could be linear. So you might not even have to do step 5 or 6. You might be able to jump right to step 7 if it's not a quadratic. Okay. So I'm going to add question number 2 right now. This is from your notes that I uploaded on Google Classroom, so check the notes. So question number 2 is 2 over x minus 10 minus 3 over x minus 2 equals 6 over x squared minus 12x plus 20. Okay, so first step is finding least common denominator. So least common denominator is x minus 10 from the first fraction, x minus 2 from the middle fraction. My right fraction has to be factored. So I'm looking for what multiplies to be 20 that adds to be negative 12. So 20 would be 2 and 10, 4 and 5. So out of those options, 2 and 10 add to be my middle term of 12. However, the 12 is negative, so I need to make sure that both of those factors are also negative. So x minus 2, x minus 10. Now, because this right fraction has everything from the least common denominator, I do not have to write it again. It is exactly what my least common denominator is. Next step, multiply each fraction by the missing term. So my left fraction is missing x minus 2. And technically I'm doing this to top and bottom, I'm just never messing with my denominator. Middle fraction is missing x minus 10. Again, technically I'm doing this to top and bottom, I'm just never really going to mess with the denominator. Right fraction has x minus 2 and it has x minus 10, so I do not have to multiply by anything. Once I create the least common denominators that are all three the same, they cancel each other out. It's beautiful. I don't have to deal with this fraction anymore. Step 3 is to FOIL or use the distributive property. So now I'm just, again, messing with my denominator here. Or sorry, numerator. The denominator is gone. So I'm going to do distributive property, and then on the right side I don't have to do anything because my denominator was already everything from the least common denominator. So distributive property, 2 times x, 2 times negative 2. I'm going to change this to plus negative 3 so that I don't forget my negative. I'm doing the distributive property again. So negative 3x, negative 3 times negative 10 is a positive 30. Now I'm just going to add my like terms. So my like terms are 2x, negative 3x. I'm going to add negative 4 and 30, which is positive 26. This is a linear. So because it's a linear, I have a single x. We're just going to solve for x. So I'm subtracting 26 from both sides. Now again, I'm only allowed to do this because I don't see an x squared. In the last example that we did, we had an x squared, which meant that we had to do the quadratic, setting it equal to 0, factoring, or the quadratic formula. So now I have a negative in front of this, so I'm going to divide by negative, and I get x equals 20. Negative 20 divided by negative 1. Now I'm going to go back and check my excluded values. And the excluded values are coming from the denominator, or the least common denominator. Set that equal to 0, so x cannot be 10. And I'm going to do the second part to that, x minus 2, set that equal to 0, x cannot be 2. So these are my excluded values. I have to go and check them against my answer. So my excluded values were 10 and my answer is 20, so that's okay. This excluded value was 2, my answer was 20, so my answer of 20 is good. So a little less work in there. We got to skip steps 5 and 6 because I didn't have a quadratic, which means I didn't have to factor, and I get to go right to solving by setting it equal to each other. Okay, last example I'm going to do with you guys, and then I'm going to give you one to try on your own, and I will check that one on Friday. So last question together is 2 over x squared minus 6x plus 8. So when I created these notes, I did them on Google Docs. Google Docs does not allow me to write an x squared, not sure why. when I write an equation. So you will see below the equation what it should say, because Google Docs won't let me do that superscript. Alright, so first we're going to find the least common denominator. I have a quadratic, which means that I'm going to need to factor my quadratic. Looking for what multiplies to be 8. That adds to be -6. 8 would be 4 and 2. My middle sign is a negative, my last sign is a positive, so negative times negative makes a positive. -4 plus -2 is -6. My right fraction has x minus 4, and my right fraction has x minus 2. So my least common denominator is x minus 4, x minus 2, because this has that part, and the last fraction has that part. Okay, next step, multiply each fraction by the missing term. So my left fraction has everything from my least common denominator. I do not have to multiply that by anything. My middle fraction has the x minus 4. It's missing x minus 2. My right fraction has x minus 2. It's missing x minus 4. And technically, again, I'm doing it numerator denominator. Once all three denominators look exactly the same, and only after this step do they all cancel out. You cannot do that step first. You have to make sure they have a least common denominator first. Now I'm just going to copy this work down. So again, I'm just doing the numerator. My denominators just canceled because I got the least common denominator. So now I'm going to do a distributive property. So x minus 2, 1 times anything is itself. 2 times x, and 2 times -4. Once I do the distributive property, I'm going to add like terms. So I'm going to add 1x and 2x, which make 3x. I'm going to add -2 and -8, which add to be -10. And now I'm just going to solve this equation. I don't have to do step 5 or step 6 because it's not a quadratic. So it's not a quadratic. I don't have to factor. I just get to go right to my solving part because this is a linear equation. So I'm going to add 10. Remember that I said to you guys on Tuesday I did the more difficult question with you. So it should not be nearly as difficult as what I did with you on Tuesday. Giving you guys a little bit easier questions to do here. Okay, so once I found my answers, I have to check my excluded values. The excluded values come from the denominator set equal to 0. So x minus 4, set that equal to 0. X cannot be 4. Set my x minus 2 equal to 0. X cannot be 2. I'm going to go check my excluded values against my answer, and x minus 4, or x equals 4 is my answer, but it's also my excluded. So I'm going to kick this answer out. Because I don't have another answer because it wasn't a quadratic, I have to say that there is no solution. And there's no solution because my answer that I got was an excluded value, which means that cannot happen. So it is not a solution. Okay, I'm going to leave you guys with one question to do on your own. I will post the answer to this question that you guys are going to do on your own on Friday. The question you guys are doing on your own is 3 over x minus 8 minus 4 over x minus 2 equals 28 over x squared minus 10x plus 16. And again, in Google Docs, it won't let me write that, so I put it underneath there. So check back in on Friday, and I will give you the work and the answer to that one. This is under the Material tab, and then I also submitted your assignment. Good luck, and I will be back with you on Friday.